Last week I got sick with COVID, and for some reason, that made me want to go back and play as all the characters you're not supposed to from the original 3 Mortal Kombat games. Especially with it being a fighting game, where so much of the gameplay revolves around which character you pick, the idea that there were entire characters built in that you couldn't pick, and that you didn't really get to experience the way they played, has always just fascinated me for some reason.
Hey everybody, check out the all-new Mortal Kombat! It's our grand opening! It has over 100 fabulous
Smoke, Jade, Kintaro.
And the best part is, you can't come!
I think a big part of what got people like me interested in stuff like this back in the day was how gaming used to have a lot more rumors, with a lot less internet to spoil some of the fun.
To find the actual Triforce in Ocarina of Time, what you need to do is start a new game. Enter your name as Naburu and get all the way to the Spirit Temple. She'll say that is what I am called. I like you. Complete the Spirit Temple and she will give you the medallion and a slip of paper. The horse is named Lightning. Then beat the running man. The running man will say he cheated. Chase him to Lon Lon Ranch. Use the blue boss key in Ganondorf's castle and you'll be in front of Ganondorf. Bounce it back at him to kill him. Then you'll get the real Triforce and see the true ending.
And with Mortal Kombat in particular, with how they had already shown every now and then that sometimes their rumors would be true. So years and years after trying to beat the game without blocking, or putting in the blood code at the exact moment that Shao Kahn explodes, or whatever, and never really getting to play as Kintaro or Jade or Goro, I just got a hankering to go back and see what can actually be done if you just sort of force your way into those, at least with the first 3 games. The original Mortal Kombat has 10 characters in the cast. Sort of. Inside the game's memory, there are 9 slots allocated to the character selection for both the Player 1 side and the Player 2 side. In the first character slot, there's Johnny Cage, then Kano, Raiden, Liu Kang, Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and then Sonya. Just like if you moved across them in the character select screen. If you go a slot past Sonya though, you get to Goro, who takes up the 8th slot, and then in the 9th slot is Shang Tsung. Finally, most people already know that the original MK features a secret boss character. The first secret boss character in any fighting game, with Reptile. But despite Reptile being objectively the coolest ever, he doesn't actually have his own spot in the game's memory. When you fight him, he is Scorpion, all the way down to what his name looks like in the health bar. Reptile didn't exist in the original arcade release of the game. He was added in a later revision and sort of Frankenstein together to make another boss character and put a cool secret from the existing ninja characters that they already had. When you play against him, you usually start the encounter fighting Scorpion, and his palette data is just modified to make the color green instead of blue or yellow. His movement speed is dramatically sped up, and he uses both Scorpion and Sub-Zero's moves. Except, as far as trying to capture him as a selectable character, him having both special moves is more of an illusion. What happens during the match is that Reptile completely flips between being Scorpion or being Sub-Zero, using a similar logic to what happens when you fight Shang Tsung in the final boss fight, but without showing the player what's happening. You can kind of play as him by modifying the Player 1 palette and the movement speed and then selecting Scorpion, but not really. Especially because you're not going to be able to access the logic that toggles in between the 2 characters. So, for Mortal Kombat 1, I didn't spend a lot of time trying to back into a mostly playable Reptile. Goro, on the other hand, has his own character slot in memory, and if you force the Player 1 selection to point to Goro, then you can actually load into the match as him. The problem comes around when you try to actually do anything with him. Pressing pretty much any of the buttons will cause the game to crash, moving him in certain ways causes the game to crash, taking damage in certain ways causes the game to crash. You're not really going to be able to play as Goro without the game just shutting down. The thing is, in the majority of games, if the application tries to point to a location in memory and then nothing's there, that ends up instigating a crash. Normally, when a player controls one of the characters they're supposed to play as, they'll send inputs to the system with the controls. Block, low punch, low kick, high kick, and even the combinations they use for special moves. The player is assigned to the character, and the character is assigned to different actions based on what they press. Goro doesn't have this logic built into his code, so when the player sends any input signal to make those things happen, they point to nothing. The game bombs out. It works completely different for CPU opponents, who they work off of routines and different patterns. they don't work based on trying to simulate controller inputs, and that's why the AI gets to do things like bullshit input reads, or busting out instant special moves that normally the player would have to hold down a button and charge. So unless you mod the game, you really can't do much of anything with him. For the sake of sport, I did force a scenario where I played as Goro and he won the round, where he would do nothing so he wouldn't cause the game to crash, but I controlled both characters' health bars. After he won though, the game crashed. It shouldn't come as any surprise that Shang Tsung causes pretty much the exact same scenario. You can force him to appear as your character in the match, but then it's choose your destiny, but all of your destinies are system crashes. With Mortal Kombat 2, which was my main squeeze as a kid, all of the boss and secret characters were planned ahead of time. So unlike Reptile from MK1, every single one of the characters has their own proper assignment within the memory. And there are a lot more characters here too. You've got Kung Lao first, then Liu Kang, Johnny Cage, Baraka, Kitana, Mileena, Shang Tsung, Raiden, Sub-Zero, Reptile, Scorpion, and Jax. Once you get past the main cast that you can play as, the next character slot goes to Kintaro, then Shao Kahn, Smoke, Noob Saibot, and finally Jade. And this is honestly what I had in mind when I started messing with all this in the first place. I really just wanted to load into MK2 as Kintaro and stomp on the CPU for every piece of input reading crap they've done over all these years. Unfortunately though, MK2 has some of the same limitations that MK1 has. When the player presses certain controls, it goes to actions that are read by either Kintaro, Shao Kahn, Noob, Jade, or Smoke, but those inputs don't actually tell it to do anything, so the game crashes. Pretty much every time for all of them. But I did also try to do the same thing on the Sega Genesis port of the game, and the results there were at least more interesting to play around with. I tried poking around the different memory locations and see if I could find what controlled the character selection, same as I did with everything else so far, but I wasn't having a lot of luck. But since it's the Sega Genesis, that means that I could use Game Genie, and with that, I was able to find some really old forum posts where people had already kind of worked out a method to get these characters playable. The method is to use the Game Genie to force certain opponent scenarios when you load the game, like you're facing Kintaro, or Shao Kahn, or one of the secret ninjas, but then to start a one-player game and use the second player controller to do it. It'll load into a new ladder mode, and you'll be controlling the unplayable character. Smoke, Jade, and Noob all feel similar to the characters their palette swapped from. They can block, punch, move, jump, and high kick without really disrupting much of the game. Just for some reason, if you dare try to throw a low kick, that's it. The game will crash on that. Still, they keep their increased walk speed, Jade stays projectile immune, there's some funky stuff happening with the special moves if you try to use them. The big downside really is just that Smoke doesn't make his smokies. Kintaro and Shao Kahn, on the other hand, don't play anywhere near as clean, but they make up for it by being fucking hilarious. Sometimes Kintaro can block the opponent and automatically throw them. Sometimes he can block the opponent and crash the game. He doesn't really have a proper backward walk animation, he's got a really funky jump, and he crashes the game if he tries to crouch. But what I really love about him is that if you press high kick, he strikes a wind pose, but while he's doing his wind pose, his big punch move actually activates and the hitbox activates. So you kind of just march across the screen, flexing and knocking the opponent back continuously. It's not exactly what I had in mind when I wanted to play as him, but it still feels pretty good. While playing Shao Kahn, his high kick is a little less helpful. His punch, though, activates what looks like the shoulder charge, but it uses the hitbox state of his regular punch. Still, you can jank your way through the entire single-player ladder and get the non-existent endings, which do eventually crash the game. Kintaro even does a downright delightful little jig when he wins. If you really want to play as these characters in MK2, the best way to go is with Mortal Kombat 2 Plus, which is an unbelievably well-made fan-made patch for the arcade version. They really took their time with it and made fully playable versions of Jade, Noob, Smoke, with his Smokies, Kintaro, and Shao Kahn. They also put a lot of other cool stuff in there, but to play as the characters you do have to unlock them first, and I was already trying to update the memory addresses to just make the changes, so I did try in their version, and they were even cheeky enough to put in a little Easter egg for someone like me.
You weak, pathetic Fool.
Playing the characters in this patched version of the game is how I always kind of imagined it. And other than Kintaro and Shao Kahn being locked to only one possible arena and not being able to do boss against boss gameplay, it's pretty much exactly what I had in mind when I started doing this. I'm really grateful that they put in so much work. Of the original trilogy, MK3 was the one that I spent by far the least amount of time with when I was younger. They took MK3 in kind of a bold direction as far as its roster was concerned. They kind of shucked off the ninja characters, both the male and female ones, and only kept Sub-Zero. And they gave him kind of a completely different look, going away from the legacy look of the MK ninjas in pajamas. There are some rumors that the reason they didn't move forward with the ninja characters, and Johnny Cage and Raiden for that matter, is because of some drama between Midway and the actors who played them in the previous games, Daniel Pesina and his brother. But knowing how they designed Sub-Zero for this one, I kind of assumed they were already planning to go in a different direction, because also they probably could have gotten somebody else to just do motion capture in pajamas. The problem with doing that, though, is that the majority of MK fans at the time, myself definitely included, were like, where the fuck are my ninjas? And we eventually got an expanded version called Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, now with a whole bunch of ninjas. They also took a different approach with the style around the secret characters in this game. So starting with vanilla MK3, it still has your unplayable boss characters, even though one of them is just Shao Kahn again. And it does have a secret palette swap boss, but the big secret is just an unlockable player character with smoke. The palette swapped character this time is a palette swap of Kano, and it's called Noob Saibot again, and it's kinda lame. The same method I used to try to track down the character selection in the memory does work here. Now the slots are reserved in the order of Kano, Sonya, Jax, Nightwolf, Sub-Zero, Striker, Sindel, Sector, Cyrax, Kung Lao, Cabal, Shiva, Shang Tsung, Liu Kang, and then Smoke at the end. When you go one slot further, you get Mataro, then Shao Kahn, and finally Noob Saibot. Still with the game crashing anytime you try to do anything, but now a lot funnier. I spent a lot more of my time focusing on Ultimate MK3 because it's the one that has ninjas, and I haven't changed. That's still what I want from Mortal Kombat. Instead of such a big focus being on unplayable secret boss characters, this one really just focused on putting unplayable characters that you could later unlock and make playable. So it has secret characters. There's Mileena, Ermac, and classic Sub-Zero, but you unlock them in a more traditional sense. You've got unplayable boss characters with Mataro and Shao Kahn, but it's just them again. And then finally you've got legitimately secret characters with Human Smoke and Noob Saibot, who's now a real ninja and not Shadow Kano, but they're secretly selectable, not secretly unplayable. They're meant to be played. You just do it in kind of a backward sort of way. The big one with UMK3 that most people already know about is Rain, because he shows up in the arcade version's attract mode for a few seconds. And that was actually just a practical joke on the fans. The font on his life bar is a dead giveaway, but he is straight up not in the game at all. It's just video manipulation. The Sega Genesis version of UMK3 though, although being kind of a so-so port in my opinion, does cook up some crazy stuff. First and foremost, Mataro and Shao Kahn are unlockable characters in the game. They're only meant to be used in versus mode, but because they have commands that are mapped to the controller, you can manipulate the game and take them into ladder mode like any other character. They don't have Shiva in the game's roster, because fuck her I guess, but they do have Rain. So fuck the arcade players, I guess. And his round the world kick is actually invented in this version of the game. What's really bizarre on the Genesis version though is Chameleon. Not Chameleon with a K, but with a C. You might know him if you played MK Trilogy or Armageddon, but in Trilogy, he's meant to be all of the male ninjas rotating between each other. Well, it turns out that they were already thinking of him back on the Genesis port of UMK3, because he has a proper character slot in the game. He loads in pretty much just as Scorpion with no special moves, but it says you're Chameleon. And speaking of Chameleon and palette swapping in the Genesis version, you can get up to some kind of funky stuff with the palettes in the game. You can load in with any character you want, and any palette loaded from another character at the same time. You can do things like load in with Reptile and see his colors change. There's not really anything to that or special about it. I just thought it was neat. One last thing I do want to call out is that the same team that made Mortal Kombat 2 Plus also made a fan patch of UMK3, and they put some really, really cool stuff into it. They have a fully playable Rain, who plays just like the Sega Genesis version, but who looks great because he's on the arcade. They have a completely playable Chameleon, who's super fun. They have the N64 version of Sub-Zero from MK Trilogy, who's overpowered. They have Shao Kahn playable, and they even went all out and made their own version of Triborg for the game. And that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say about that.